Welcome to Muse Homeschool Art Sessions. This week we're going to be continuing with our nature journal. This is part 2 of the nature journal when we're going to be embedding from a photograph. So this week you're going to need your watercolour paints, some white acrylic paint or white emulsion paint if you have any spare in the house. Ask anyone you're living with to see if you have any, and obviously a paintbrush and some water to clear your paintbrush with. The first thing that we're going to do before we start embedding the second picture is adding some more colour to the page. So I'm using blue because blue, as I told you last week, if you remember, creates an optical illusion. So it actually brings everything else on the page forward and it creates depth. So if you ever want to make something look far away, like if you're painting a hole or you're painting a cave, if you add blue, even if you can't necessarily recognise it with your eyes, it will actually make it look deeper. It will create an optical illusion and set it further back away from what's in the foreground. So where I'm adding all this paint to my page, it's important to remember that using water by itself is also a really useful tool. Now you might notice that I don't mix my paints in a palette beforehand, I mix them directly on the page. So when you're mixing paints directly on the page, use water just as you would use a normal colour. But water serves as a way to blend colours together and it helps you feather the edges of any colours that you've added to your page. I'm using yellows as well because yellows and blues are the two primary colours that make up green. So as we're doing a nature page, I'm going to stick with a nice nature colour theme. So before we do any painting, you're going to stick your image down that you've printed off. But before you stick it down, you need to rip it out. You need to rip out the part you're going to use. To get a nice clean edge like I'm using here, you've actually ripped the piece towards you that you're going to stick down, and the piece that you rip away from you is the piece you're going to discard. Then you get a nice clean flat edge. So before you start adding any colour, you're going to kind of paint the outlines of what you can see in your picture off of the page. So what I'm using here is my fungal covered piece of wood, my big tree branch, and I'm painting to the bottom left and the top right. I'm painting the edges in with a few small shapes to give me an idea of where things are. Now before I start adding a lot of colour to the page, there's some areas that I need to give a white base to first. Because I've got a blue page where I did my nice kind of colour wash earlier, I need to blank that out again to give me a nice simple base to add some colours to. Because if I try and add yellows and browns to the blue, it won't give me the kind of colour that I want to have. So I'm going to put some white down first to allow me to paint on and create a nice clean colour that I want on top. So once you've added some basic shapes, you've added your outlines, you've extended from your picture, now's the time to start thinking about the colours that you can see. Now what you can do if you want to, which I'm doing here, is I'm actually using some white paint first in this top right hand corner. It's actually a little bit of white emulsion that I had left over, which works just as well as acrylic paint when doing an activity like this. I'm starting to mix a blue onto the page, just a blue that I have in my palette. I haven't mixed it first, I've just chosen the blue from my palette and I've started adding it, and actually it's really close to what I can see in my picture that I've stuck down. Always remember with embedding, whatever you're painting onto the page, always bring a little bit of that onto the picture that you're sticking down as well, because remember we're trying to camouflage the edge of the photo, so we don't want to see where the photo ends and where your page and your painting begins. We need to try and make it as difficult to see as possible, so we need to match the colours, the details, the shapes as accurately as we can. I love doing extending activities like this because you really do get to use your imagination. Even though you're copying from the picture, you're copying the colour, you're imitating the shapes that you can see, you're using your imagination to create what happens either side of your picture. Now obviously you want to make it look as much like what you can see in the picture as you can, but the shapes and the lines, the direction that twig goes in is actually completely up to you. So really do have fun with how you're going to embed it here. So I'm starting to add some more blacks and blues to the background of this branch to try and clear a little bit more for myself where the shape is going to be. So it's starting midway in the page and it's coming down towards the left. Now I'm starting to add just some different tones of blue to this top part of the picture, still painting onto the image as well to blend it in. So once I've added the blues, you can see I've added some blues to the bottom left as well and to the top right. I'm now going to start painting the colours I can see in the actual pieces of fungi themselves. So I can see browns and yellows, and again, I'm not mixing any of my colours first. I'm just taking the colours from my palette and adding it to the page. And they're not an expensive set of paints that I have. In most watercolour palettes you will have a couple of yellows, a couple of reds, a couple of blues. You'll have a cool and a warm one of each. And the variety of colours that you can make from them is actually quite amazing. So what I'm trying to do now is I'm trying to start to mark on where the rest of those little fungi details will be. I'm really being delicate with my paintbrush. I haven't added too much paint. I've made it quite watery. So I'm just starting to make the edge of this wood here a little bit clearer. So where the shapes are going to be. Do I want smaller pieces of fungi or bigger pieces of fungi? What can I see in my image that has been stuck down? I can see that the fungi on the right hand side are smaller than on the left. So I can tell that my branch is actually slightly coming towards me. So I probably want to have slightly larger ones on the left hand side. What I'm going to do now, I've added the shapes of the fungi in. You can see I've made some ovals with my black paint and I've started filling some mustard and brown colours in. I'm going to start adding the highlights that I can see. So we did the shape, the basic shape, extending of the shapes. So I've started adding the basic colours that we can see, some shadows ever so slightly. Just so where we can see the darker points of the painting, and now I'm going in ever so gently with some highlights. It's always quite scary adding highlights or adding really deep shadows to a piece of work, because there's always a part of you that we're thinking, oh my goodness, what if I make a mistake? One thing to remember with painting, which I absolutely love, is that there's nothing that you can do that can't be rectified. If you add too much colour or too dark a colour, once it's dried you can always go over it. This technique that I'm using here to add these more textured areas of my branch that I can see on my picture, this is called stippling. So I've added some white paint to my paintbrush and I'm literally dabbing it onto the page. So I'm almost stamping it, but not on its top, not on its point. I'm actually dabbing it on the side of the paintbrush, and this is called stippling. I'm stippling with my paintbrush to add texture, because I can see that the branch isn't smooth, so I want to create that lovely illusion of a textured branch. So I've started now adding some darker browns to these areas here to try and create an illusion of something three-dimensional. Something three-dimensional will have shadows, they'll have highlights, and to create something that looks realistic, which I'm trying to achieve here, you need to think about where the shadows and where the highlights are going to be. So looking at the picture you've stuck down, the first thing you need to think about is where your light source is coming from. Now your light source could be anything from the sun, a lamp. What can you see in your picture? Now I can see the majority of my shadows are on the right hand side of that branch, which means the light source will be coming from the left. It will be coming from the opposite side. So all of my shadows that I'm adding would be where the shadows would naturally occur. So if the light hits something on the left, a shadow would be formed on the right hand side. These are the things that make your paintings or your drawings look much more realistic, thinking about the light source and the dark source. If at any point I'm going too quickly, please do pause the video, go back through it a few times if you would like to, and just remember it's all about practicing and practice making perfect. This is all about colour recognition, recognising details and shapes, thinking about your tone and your form, your highlights and your shadows, thinking about how to make something look realistic by adding deeper tones, which means deeper shadows, and how to build your confidence in realising that you can actually do it. You're painting what you can see, which means you have to look. So you do have to keep looking at the picture that you've stuck down, keep looking at the colours that you can see. and keep trying to match them best you can. So the only thing I have in my palette here is some of the white emulsion paint that we had left over in our house, so I can mix my colours with them. But again, I don't mix them in my palette, I mix them directly on the page. And I'm going to now start adding some yellows, because I can see little hints, little suggestions of yellows in the branch that I haven't quite managed to get into my own painting yet. So I'm going to start adding those things into my painting. It's always a bit daunting when you think you can see a colour and you're not sure, and you're trying to match it and you're trying not to make a mistake. The thing that I've realised over the years, as I said a moment ago, is you can always rectify it. So I'm less nervous of making a mistake now, because I know if it doesn't look right, I can just paint over it again if it's not quite what I was after. Adding some yellows to the textured part of the branch there as well, and I'm really starting to be quite happy with what I am looking at now. Now, the thing that can start making it look more realistic is to add those finer details. So to add finer details, you have to be quite brave, and you have to take that leap of faith and use the dark colours. So in this case, I'm using a pure black watercolour. I've made it quite thick on my paintbrush. I can tell that by seeing that my paintbrush is completely covered in colour. And I've started to add some deeper shadows, and I've started to bring the shadows out a little bit. To add some smaller shadows, if your paintbrush isn't quite small enough, pens are always a really fantastic way of doing that. So you can get drawing pens from any drawing shop. You can get different size nibs, thick ones, small ones, medium ones, depending on the details that you want to add. So after this week's session, you should now have an embedded leaf and an embedded photo, 2 things on your page. And next week we're going to be looking at how to draw a flower, so some flower illustration. Remember to keep practicing. If you don't feel that you got it the first time, please have fun with it, build your confidence, and remember, everybody has to learn. So well done, you've done a great job. Thanks for watching.